Well, it is a Thursday evening in February, and so I just want to say thank you to those who are spending some of that evening with us. I know there's a lot of exciting things to be doing on a Thursday night. One of those could simply be relaxing at home. So hopefully we're somewhere comfortable, ready to learn more about our STAR score reports here at the middle of year assessment window. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. I have with me tonight Miss Kelly Bourne, my amazing assistant principal here from Wayne. Kelly, say hi.
Good evening, everyone. Glad that you're here.
And I have Mrs. Sarah Steiner, our ELD department coordinator.
Hi, everyone.
If you are in need of this deck in a different language, please let Sarah know. You can use the chat. And let's go
They
ahead
will
and
need to
get
put it in
started.
I'm sorry, Dr. Marzano, they
Nope,
will
go
need to
ahead
put it in a Q&A.
in
And
the
so
Q&A.
anything that you need tonight, please put it in the Q&A. The chat has been disabled for this webinar. And so we will be monitoring the Q&A.
Excellent. So here's our agenda tonight. We're going to be taking a look at our multi-tiered system of support, or MTSS. I know we throw out a lot of acronyms in education, so making sure we pause and explain them. And the reason we're going to start there is because data in the absence of action is really not very much. And so we want to make sure that if we look at these reports, we're confident understanding, well, how do our teachers and our schools use them? That will flow easily into those STAR assessments and the reports themselves. So hopefully you have one of those handy. They should have been sent home with your students in the last few days. We'll then make the connection to elementary teaching and learning. So after having a chance to process, okay, this is what my score report says about my child or my children. What are we doing about it? And lastly, as Ms. Bourne explained, we'll be opening up the Q&A to welcome your questions. Throughout this presentation, rather than hold on everything till the end, if you find you do have a question, feel free to enter at any time. You will not be interrupting anything. This will give us a chance to review, and we'll push those to the end of our presentation. We've already gotten some great questions in advance, and so we'll have some commonly or frequently asked questions. And anything that we don't get to tonight, if there's something we, for example, have to do a little bit more research on, we'll be compiling an FAQ after tonight. So kicking off here, we are going to start, as good MTSS does, with a pre-assessment. So, surprise, surprise, pop quiz, everybody. We're wondering, how confident do you feel right now in understanding your child's STAR family report? I'm a former science teacher, so this is like my Super Bowl, getting to watch data roll in. This is amazing. Well, look at that. We have a bit of a bell curve, something we'll be referring to this evening. Seems the largest number is somewhat confident, around the middle, a 3. We have a few folks who are very confident, in which case would love to have you come off mute and help me with this. Just kidding. That's not a feature. And it is an opportunity for us to hopefully build on areas we're concerned or confused, and then hopefully maybe confirm some of those things we're already very confident about. All right, we're going to keep moving on. So for those of us that join for our board report, this will be a familiar slide, as this is our process for unlocking the potential of all students. Data is one of those things we use to inform our continuous improvement process. We come together as teams to look over how our students are performing. We identify interventions and supports. You'll see some of those images again later. We talk a lot about action plans, but really, how does this inform instruction? What does this mean for us in the classroom, in intervention? And last, of course, is the goal, students reaching their highest potential. To better explain this, we talk a little bit about our multi-tiered system of support. And before we go on, I know that's also a bit of a mouthful. I want folks to recognize, to really simplify this, this is really just how we do teaching and learning in the 21st century. We have a lot of great data about students, and so we tier the needs to the point where students are growing. And so that tier 1, the base of the pyramid, is intentionally large, and that's because the vast majority of our students really have their needs met in the core instruction in the reg ed classroom. We have some very high quality curricula. We have, of course, some of the most talented teacher in the state, if not the country. But there are always then some students, no matter what school you work in, where they don't meet their potential in just that setting. And we know that because we routinely look at that data. And so when we get that result and we say, you know what, we think we might need to push things a little further, that could be because the student is already above grade level. That could be because they're below grade level. We talk about targeted intervention. Now, good news is that our teachers utilize small group instruction, and so some of these interventions happen right there in the classroom. We also have some incredible support staff. We have our MTSS teams. They do a variety of interventions. Woo, Miss Steiner. In the classroom, they can push in, they can pull students out of the classroom. But even then, sometimes those tier two small group interventions aren't effective either. And so after a period of time where we haven't seen students make progress the way we would expect, we talk about tier three intensive intervention. And that's usually more of a one-to-one. Sometimes we try to do a more holistic approach to see what might be keeping the student from being successful. But the benefit here is that many hands make light work, and we have teams of very talented educators that step in at each level of this pyramid. But I'm going to turn this concept on its head, actually literally, as we in Radnor like to be special and have instead of a pyramid, a diamond. Now, this really reflects what we just saw earlier, that idea of a bell curve. And so I want you to keep in mind that idea that the bulk of our students there in the middle benefit and reach their potential through high quality, evidence based, differentiated instruction for all. Now, on either end of that bell curve, you still have some students who are saying, hey, you know what? I'm growing, but I could grow more. Perhaps I need an additional push. If I'm on the right side there, you see tier two targeted enrichment interventions and supports. And then again, students who may not quite be reaching where we would expect from core instruction, and then they move into more of the remedial intervention and support. Each school has an MTSS team that works to identify and address those student needs. Those teams include, but are not limited to, our MTSS coordinators, those team leads, having a big hand in the development of this data, reading specialists who come with specialized certifications, English learner teachers, for example, Ms. Steiner here, teachers of gifted learning who help to push up on that enrichment side, both with how they pull students out as well as how they consult with classroom teachers, and more, because each of our three schools differ at least a little bit in terms of our student population. But then how do we identify these needs? That is why we are all here tonight. We use a variety of assessments. We will be spending our time talking about STAR, but we'll also touch upon Acadience and other methods of determining how are students making progress. So let's jump into those STAR score reports. Hopefully you have one of these guys in your hand. We're ready to roll through this together. You'll see I have two pictures here. The first one, which we're not going to get into as much detail, is the early literacy parent report. Now, I'm sorry, this is not as colorful. There's just no family report version for the early literacy. And if you have this, it's because your student's probably in first or second grade, and they are still working on pre-reading skills. You can see some examples of those listed here: phonics, letter recognition, early word comprehension. And I don't want you to be too concerned here. We have all this data in front of us to inform what is the teacher doing to work with that student on developing those early or pre-reading skills. After they've mastered them, students then go on to take STAR reading. Moving into that report, you should have one of these each for reading and for math. And in the domain scores, it breaks down some of those skills that we're focused on. In reading, some examples include comprehension, vocabulary knowledge, reading fluency. In math, mathematical understanding, basic operations, algebraic concepts. If ever you wanted to get into greater detail as to, well, what does that standard entail? I would encourage you to check out the Common Core website. We've got some great detail for each grade level as to what does a standard within algebraic concepts entail. It's more than just procedural math. It's more than just doing our times tables, for example. It includes procedural, conceptual, and application strands to make sure our students aren't just becoming talented calculators, but mathematicians who can reason, explain, create, and make products. So let's practice one together here. I am a Radnor parent here. I put a different hat on. And this is my daughter, Bella Barrett. Seems to have a different last name than me. And she is in third grade. So as a Radnor parent, I'm going to be reading through this to understand what is my child working on, where do they need support, and I'm going to consult with the definitions provided here. And if after this presentation you want more information, you want to go deeper, the Renaissance website, the company that produces STAR, has some very detailed videos and blogs. We'll look at a little bit of those resources together tonight, but a lot of the information here comes directly from Renaissance. So, taking a look, Bella, I see first that your scaled score came back as a 613. I don't know what that means. 613 seems kind of like a random number. So I'm going to use some of the context clues on this big, beautiful bar chart to see that you are falling into level 2, standard nearly met. Okay. Okay. So that doesn't seem that you're quite at that grade level expectation here at the middle of the year quite yet. But this is a pretty big range. So I'm wondering, is that the best measure, this 613? How are our teachers looking at this? But at standard nearly met, I'm not as concerned as the red down there. I maybe would have some more questions. As I go through, I know that this benchmark tells me a little bit more about where my student is falling, and this is relative to their peers. So the benchmarks determine what big bucket of proficiency Bella is falling into. I see that with that scaled score of 613, she is pretty solidly in that standard nearly met. Okay, well, the year's halfway over. I'm hoping that Bella's going to show greater growth as the year goes on. So that brings me to percentile rank. So here is where I see Bella's performing at the 37th percentile, and that means better than 37% of peers. And that's not a Radner percentile, that is across the country. So this is a nationally provided assessment. Having come from Chicago, I can say I know that Bella took that same assessment in Chicago. I believe students take that across many of our states. But the 37 percentile does kind of worry me. I mean, I know percents seems a little bit low, but this is percentile. So this is again compared to her national. And I got to remember that she's in that standard nearly met bucket. Okay. Now, I know that there's a number 4 on this score report. This is the grade level equivalent, but we don't really use that data. And so we're going to move right on to number 5, which is where my eye was drawn, right at those different colored boxes. And these are our domain scores. Now, immediately I see that this is from 0 to 100, so this isn't a percentile anymore. And it says mastery of each domain. So, for example, a domain score of 50 for a third grader means they are expected to answer correctly about 50% of those items. Okay. Well, for Bella, then, I'm seeing here that she has answered 37% of the questions about key ideas in detail. All right. But less of the range of reading and level of text complexity. So, that might be an area where I want to know more. How might I be able to support Bella a little further? I do see that while yellow, she is scoring higher on vocab acquisition and use. Great news at 74%. And the integration of knowledge and idea is 66%. Okay, so she's got some clear strengths, and that's going to help her as she masters those other domain scores. Well, I'm starting to wonder here. We got reds and we've got yellows, but I see there's an italicized note here. Students are not expected to have mastery of grade level skills at the beginning of the year. I imagine that's true at the middle of the year because these are taught throughout the year. And so we want to see that mastery grow as the school year progresses. Well, I appreciate that she is being compared then to other students nationally at the same grade level as her. But I'd be wondering, as conferences approach, what are some of the things that Bella really needs to focus on, and how is her small group helping her with that? I'm still a little confused though. I see that she's got this percentile based on her scaled score, and then I see that we have these percents mastered in these domain scores. So I've done a little bit of digging, and I've found on the website here a video that explains the difference between those criterion referenced, which are those domain scores, and the norm referenced, which are the scaled score or the percentile. So I'm going to hope this video answers some of my questions that I've listed here on the left. Why might these be a little bit different based on the color? How do they compare to one another? So for that, I'm going to check out our assessment minutes video. This will be a quick, less than 5-minute video that gets in a little bit more detail that helps me to understand.
Hi, I'm Gene, and welcome to Assess Minutes, where we take a complex assessment topic and break it down to make it easily understandable, because minutes matter.
Well, Gene seems friendly.
One idea that some folks stumble over as they try to interpret the scores and the reports of various assessments relates to the concept of the two major types of assessment, norm referenced and criterion referenced. So let's take a look at these two, what they're doing, how they are some ways alike, and how they are in some ways operationally quite different as well. When we think about norm referenced assessments, the bell curve ought to pop into your mind because it's through these bell curves of distribution of performance that we begin to make meaning of the results. We take students and we compare them to the norm. Where are they falling in here? So any dialogue that we ever have about the mean score, about standard deviations, about percentiles, deciles, quartiles, quintiles, those types of things, that is all language that is inherently couched in a norm referenced assessment. Again, where the performance of a student is compared against the norm. So for example, a student performing at the 45th percentile is then performing as well as or better than 45% of their academic peers. In contrast, criterion references or referenced assessments, are not overly concerned about how all the kids perform. What they're concerned about is, do the students meet the expectation that is set? So was the student able to reach the top of the wall and make it over to the other side? This is the level of performance that was expected of them. Were they able to clear that? So the real problem about these two types is when we begin to start comparing scores between one another. To be clear, STAR assessments from Renaissance are normed referenced assessments. So we have all those norm-based scores in there. But in some reports, we use statistical linking to say, here's how the student did, and here are some very reliable projections or estimates about what would be likely of their performance against some criterion referenced assessments like state tests. The problem comes in when we start comparing the different scores. And ultimately, it has to do with how tall is the wall that represents the criterion referenced assessment. It's possible that in some tests, someone may have set a very, very high level of expectation. So the criterion reference point is super, super high, which means even some of the students with high percentiles, 70, 75, and 80, if that wall is really tall, they might not even be able to clear it. Conversely, sometimes folks set criterion referenced levels of expectation that are relatively low. And as a result, what you find is massive numbers of kids, an enormous percentage of those within the curves of distribution are able to clear that reference. Ideally, what we find is they should line up to some degree. There's been a lot of dialogue in our country lately about rising levels of expectation. And one of the things that we can tell you is, and when we look at the more recent test, the expectations have gone higher. So sometimes now you do have students that perform, say, at the 50th, 55th, or maybe even 60th percentile of performance that might not yet be looking over the wall. But again, it's about what are you comparing to? Are you comparing the student to a distribution of their peers? Or are you comparing a student to a particular expectation of performance?
Well, thank you, Gene. So as you can see, there are several other videos present here. And then if you were to watch that video and click on the blog, it goes into far greater detail comparing a norm referenced or criterion referenced assessment. Now, one of the things we do know in Radnor is that the profile for our students is one of very high levels of achievement. The vast majority of our students are achieving at proficient or advanced on most, if not all, assessments. And so we do as teachers take a close look at how can we use those different domains to inform both Tier 1 and Tier 2 instruction. If we were to go further and talk more about that Tier 3, we'd likely be talking about some different assessments. And so we're going to talk now, making some connection to how do we teach and learn in elementary. Before moving on, I just wanted to highlight the website where you can access that video, as well as the blogs and other articles. I believe Ms. Bourne has a link for folks, and this will, of course, be in the in the presentation as well. Great resource for finding out more information and understanding the difference between those different assessments. So let's talk about the many assessments we use to benefit instruction for our students. We've talked a lot about STAR, but you've probably also heard at least a little bit about Acadience. Now, if you're a parent that also has kindergarten students, this is primarily what we're using, as students are often for the first time in school or for the first time receiving standardized assessments. And this tells us from K to 5, how are students doing with their foundational skills in literacy and math? Now, students sometimes are doing really well on some of the grade level standards, but they may struggle with something like numeracy. And with that, we then know better how we can lead a small group, what intervention might be necessary, what activities could benefit that student. We also have new this year Into Reading, a high quality literacy curriculum, and with it, unit assessments, spelling and vocabulary inventories, and a lot of great writing. Our teachers are learning throughout this whole year the best tools within this curriculum. And because it comes with far more resources you could even teach in 1 year, our teachers are growing in their integrity to implement what's best for their students. Teachers know that through daily work and observation with them, as well as analysis of these assessments. Last, we have Reveal Math, our math curriculum, and this provides us with some great unit assessments, sometimes pre-assessments. And the last thing I want to say about the difference in these is that if you're looking at that reading-based score report, understand that those are often skills that are spiraled to throughout the year. Math works often a little bit different. Math can be more sequential. And so as we look at this, what we do sometimes here as we review curricula is, hey, you know what? My class didn't do as hot on that domain, but that's because we haven't hit it as hard yet this year. In looking at our pacing guides for the curriculum, that is a skill that's going to come up really heavily in March and then maybe again in May. Or maybe we had some introductory lessons back in December and we're going to come back to it in an upcoming month. So another way to look at those score reports differently between reading and math. Last, tying this all together, we come back to the MTSS Diamond. And so how do teachers use these data to meet the needs of all students? Because remember, it's way more than STAR. At this point, we have had our data cycle meetings across all 3 elementary schools. Shout out to Ithan and to Radnor. In these meetings, teachers come together with their special education teams, with their MTSS support teachers, and we have some really rich conversation about what our students know and are able to do, how we know, and then what instructionally we can do to best meet their needs. That begins by considering our whole group instruction. Where are we in the curriculum? What benefits does that serve us? What kinds of lessons should we hone in on? It informs our small group instruction as we bucket our students based on some of those domain scores we may have seen earlier or areas of need evidenced in Acadians. And then intervention. What students might need some more direct Tier 2 or further at this point in the year, we may recognize if Tier 2 has not been successful, some Tier 3 supports, getting more into that one-to-one. And so before we jump into our Q&A, we're going to pause again here and do a post assessment. We've spent a little more than 20 minutes here going through how to read our score reports, hoping we see some change in how confident do we feel in reading that STAR family report. All right, results rolling in. We got a little more than half participation here. Really happy to see that we're looking at 42, 63. So a little less than 2/3 of our group here are feeling confident or very confident. Excellent. That tells me as a teacher that we're doing the right thing for our core instruction. And then if I see we still have some folks in the still not confident or just a little more confident, this might be my small group follow-up. And so my encouragement to you is to think for your next steps, reaching out to your principals, reaching out to the teacher to learn more. If we're not feeling confident, what could help us to understand? And those are some questions hopefully you can throw into the chat as well. So we're going to quick go through some common questions and answers, things that we received in advance, just to clear the air. These are things we heard a lot about. What is the process for enrichment, acceleration, and gifted education in Radnor? Well, the good news is we have a teacher of gifted learning at each of our schools. And this all falls within that umbrella of MTSS. So remember, anything teaching and learning here, that is all part of the multi-tiered system of support. In addition, we actively monitor for student needs. This is not only our duty, our responsibility, but it's the law. And so we monitor how students are growing or not in order to identify them for different plans. Each time we give one of these beginning, middle, or end of year assessments, we go through the criteria for identifying students. And if you want to know more about that criteria, whether it's for elementary or even for placement going into middle school, you can go ahead and click on that link or find it on the Radnor website. Next question, where do I go to learn more about Radnor's curricular resources? I just heard Dr. Marzano talk about this great new literacy curriculum. What's that all about? So we do have some really high quality curricula. It's always the starting point to a successful education. Encouraging you to check out that department website. It gets into each of the different curricula, and you can even see it all the way up from K to 12. Lastly, what about science? All you talked about tonight was math and literacy. As a science teacher, again, I totally hear you. What we are doing this year is a little new, and this has been years in the making. We've transitioned from weekly science instruction to a double dose of Innovation Design Studio, or IDS. This aligns to the new PA Steele's standards, which adds to that rigor of what does it mean to get a science education in Pennsylvania. And you can learn more information, once again, on our website at that specific link. We have a new teacher at each elementary school in order to satisfy that additional dose of IDS. And I got to tell you, that is some really exciting stuff that happens in there. A couple other questions here. Why score reports and why now? Why didn't we get this at the beginning of the year? Why didn't we get this last year? We are really proud of our work, the work that our teachers do every day. And we have award-winning teaching and learning here in Radnor. We're sharing STAR specifically because it presents grade level performance on the state standards. And it's the most applicable for the most students. So as I shared earlier, we mentioned the STAR early literacies. Some students may have received that instead. I also mentioned Acadience is what we use for, yes, all students, but it primarily also in kindergarten. For the sake of this evening and getting started with building our data literacy, we wanted to pick the most applicable of the assessments we give throughout the year. Well, I'm a parent. I learned a lot tonight, but what do I do next? Preparing for conferences is a great next step. Teachers have already started working in those small groups. Interventions are kicking off across the 3 elementary schools. They are hyper-focused on getting that teaching and learning going here after the pause for data meetings. But this is a great way to ask more questions about this data. Hey, I noticed this on the report. How are we addressing it? You're also encouraged to ask for activities you might want to try at home. But this is also one of those where I, as a parent, pause and say, let's remember to keep time for our students to be kids when they're outside of school. We do a heck of a lot of work with them in the building. And so when they go home, a lot of research shows playing with their friends, having some free from academic time is also a good way for the brain to stretch and grow. Lastly, what do I tell my kids about this webinar? We can say we had a fun evening with the principals, but so what? Ask what they're learning about. One of the best questions you can ask for a student is, hey, what did you learn today? Not just how are you, how did things go, was it fun, but what's something that you learned? Tell me more about this story. What's something you're excited about? What's something that made you laugh today? The most successful education comes from an active partnership between parents, students, and schools, and we are very fortunate to have some very strong partnerships here in Radnor. With that, let's open up the chat room for questions. Thank you to those who were sharing throughout the course of this presentation. Just as some clarifying notes, we welcome the questions about score reports, teaching, and learning. But as the principal Wayne right now is speaking for all 3 elementary schools, so I'm going to keep this in some ways fairly general. Also, student individual questions are confidential. Excuse me, so we're not going to get into too much of the weeds there. And if ever we said as earlier, you have any specific questions about your student or learning, you are always welcome to reach out to their teacher. Teacher's the best line of communication for what's happening in the classroom. So I'm going to
All
take a look.
right. Dr.
Yep.
Marzano, I have a question as a parent. Thank you for this information. However, as I'm looking at my STAR report, I'm noticing that my child's domain scores are all in the yellow range, but their overall level is in the proficient band. How does this add up?
Great question. So we want to remember the difference between the top of that report that shows students' performance on grade level standards relative to the nationwide norm. So that's their percentile. That tells us that their level is proficient, if that's what I'm hearing you say, that they're scoring in that proficient level or benchmark. At the same time, those domain scores are their percent correct or their mastery of individual skills that make up that proficient report. And as we heard Gene explain, sometimes that wall is pretty high for how successful we want students to be by the end of the year. And so looking at this as the middle of the year, we want to see them continue to grow so that that yellow becomes green toward the end of the year. So it may mean that they're very much on track while performing above the nationally normed percentile, but it gives the teacher some really good information as to what will continue to push that student's learning.
Thank you for that, Dr. Marzano.
You're very
Another
welcome.
another question that just comes to my mind is that, I'm aware that we use the STAR report for leveling into middle school math. And so, since it's so important, why isn't there more focus on helping students practice taking the test? And why are parents not educated in advance that students should practice at home for the start of the test? This will determine the math placement and path for the rest of tracking in middle school and beyond. Could you tell me about this, if it's correct? I'm not quite understanding.
Of course. So thinking about math placement, that is one of those where I will reference the website as far as what are the processes to get that. There are certain criteria. From what I remember in reading the website, we look at the last two administrations of STAR in their fifth grade school year. In asking how we prepare students, we want to always walk the balance between what is a good indicator of success without just teaching to the test. And so when we consider what is good teaching and learning, we talk about student discussion. Students know what they're learning and why, appropriately grouping and meeting their instructional needs. This is what most drives the student's success on those tests. But thankfully, as we've been giving STAR for several years now, we do it 3 times a year. Students do have an opportunity to practice the use of the online tool. I will connect this to PSSAs also because that's coming at the end of this year. This is the first time we'll be taking it across the board online. And so we are doing some modules in the next month to make sure students understand how to take these things and how to use the online tools. I will ask though, Ms. Steiner, as someone who gives this assessment, is there anything that you would want to add on the topic of how we administer?
Sure. So since this test is administered in classrooms, it changes based on how well the child did previously. There's not really, a way to study or prepare your children. They're being prepared for this assessment every day in the classroom, just by being here at school. So the assessment, the best way to prepare them is to make sure that they are ready to take a test and they understand that this is important, and to take their time and try really hard.
Something I will say is we look to see how long students took on tests. So thankfully, that does give us a readout of the minutes that students spent. And the test does not allow students to simply click through it, which I will say as a teacher, before we had some safeguards in place, it would happen from time to time. Thankfully, we are very vigilant. We also ensure students can't just click through. And then in the few examples where students maybe took 8 minutes on this whole assessment, we come back and we say, is this a real reflection of what you know and can do? Or were we really just not feeling it that day? And we thankfully have the ability to void a test in order to take another if it meets those very stringent criteria.
So, Dr. Marzano, the other questions that we have in the Q&A would be ones that we would want to put in a FAQ, or have each school address within the FAQ.
Understood. Well, thank you for that. And thank you again, everyone, for joining us this evening. As we come to the end of our presentation, I just want to say on behalf of all elementary schools, and I will speak for Principal Wagner, Principal Young here, we want to say thank you. Thank you for your trust and support. Caring for your children is our jobs, but it's also one of the things we love to do. As you can see, we spend a lot of time looking at this data throughout the year. And while we have data meetings at these intervals, the conversation about student and instruction never ends. And so while we begin this next data cycle with this data in mind, we recognize that as we get more data from our assessments, it's possible those groups continue to change. As certain students meet the criteria, they may be moved into a different group with a different instructional purpose. This is both the art and the science of teaching that makes a multi-tiered system of support so critical. Thank you again so much for joining us. Have a wonderful evening. And hey, if your friends wanted to see it, they missed it, this should be available on the website shortly. Bye.